All right, this video is looking at the supralaryngeal portion of the speech production system. And now this is a portion that we look at when we do introductory linguistics. We looked at it again in the first week of this course when we were building up and reminding ourselves of the basics from our introductory linguistics. And here we're just taking it and moving it a little bit further. There's always more to know, but you do have a good foundation of understanding. So this video isn't going to be that long. It moves through sort of three portions of the section of the textbook moves through three portions of the supralaryngeal system. So starting with the pharynx, which is sort of the backmost portion, we have the laryngopharynx, which really encompasses the area of the larynx, and then above that the oropharynx, the back of the behind the oral cavity, and then the nasopharynx, which is the back of the nasal cavities. And I do like how the textbook presents the pharynx as kind of a crossroads. You have the nasal passage, and the oral passage, and the esophagus, and the windpipe or trachea. In other organisms, the textbook doesn't get into this, but in other organisms, these are more closely tied, so you can actually couple the the nasal passage directly with the windpipe, the trachea, and have the oral cavity coupled with the esophagus, so you can swallow and breathe at the same time. In fact, human infants can do this up to a certain point before the larynx sort of descends too far for that sort of dual coupling, a sort of bypass set up to work. So it's not just a throwaway metaphor. There's some really real physiological insight to that crossroads idea. And the textbook also talks a little bit about swallowing, which, that's one of the roles of the pharynx is to kind of coordinate what you need to coordinate so that when you swallow food or drink, it goes down. You sort of have the two pipes at the back there, or right at the bottom, the windpipe in the front, the trachea, and the esophagus at the back leading to the stomach. And you want food and drink to go down one of those, and you want air to go down the other, and you don't want them to go down the wrong way. So swallowing is actually a very fundamental physiological purpose for a lot of these structures. We then move on to the nasal tract and the role of the nasal tract and the velum in speech. And so we learn about things like the nasal septum and the nares and all sorts of stuff like that. The role of the nasal tract in conditioning air, humidifying, warming or cooling it, depending on the environmental, the sort of ambient conditions. And this is quite important. Um, anyone who, let you in a little personal secret, anyone who, like me, has a bit of a snoring issue or some kind of sleep apnea, um, a lot of the initial interventions they do are basically meant to encourage your body to breathe through the nose when you're sleeping, because that already confers a lot of benefits before doing anything surgical or mechanical uh, otherwise. So conditioning air. And we also look at a little bit of how we can, one of the ways we can measure speech sounds is in terms of their nasalence, basically the percentage of the overall speech airflow that's going through the nasal tract. So high nasalence sounds are nasal vowels and nasal consonants, and low nasalence sounds will be considered the oral vowels and the oral consonants. Okay, and then the third part is the oral tract. And a lot of the material from this is familiar from our previous go go round at phonetics. Um, but there is some interesting, further depth here. There's a lot of muscles. The muscles around the mouth, the many many muscles in the tongue. We see a little bit more about the jaw, the temporomandibular joint they talk about, and they don't mention this, but that it should be memorable because the jaw, that bone is the mandible, and then this part of the skull is the temporal bone. So temporomandibular joint means the joint between the temporal and the mandibular bones. And you can feel when you move your jaw open and closed, if you sort of feel in front of your ears, you can feel the jaw sort of swiveling at that point. Um, and although we don't talk about the jaw as an articulator in speech, it definitely does a lot of the heavy lifting. kind of literally. Anyway, and lots of other stuff in this section. Um, and we'll get more into some of these details. But a lot of the details you already have, things like the teeth and the alveolar ridge and the palate, the hard palate, and the different parts of the tongue as we describe them, as we use them to describe speech sounds, like the tip, the blade, the body, and the root. Right? These are already familiar to us, so we don't need to go into too much depth in this video. But of course, the oral, the supralaryngeal system, the oral cavity, the sort of pharyngeal system and the nasal system are all very important for making this wide variety of speech sounds that we're just recently expanding our knowledge about to cover that idea of stuff. So um, there you have it. That's the last section of this physiology chapter in the textbook and the last portion of this module in our course. So happy studying physiology, eh?